Hello and welcome back to Dizzy Sew and Sew. Today we're looking at single bias bound hems and double bias bound hems. What you're going to need to do today's tutorial is a small piece of fabric ready to practice with, and a couple of pieces of bias binding, and of course your trusty sewing machine and all your bits that go with that. Okay, so let's look a little bit more closely at this bias tape, or this bias binding. What we've got here is the bias binding, and it comes on a reel, and it's pre-folded in this manner. It's folded over at the edges and then folded in half, which creates your binding ribbon, or your bias binding, and then it can be sewn on. There's a special technique which I'm just about to show you. Step one, I've put the bias binding edge to edge with our fabric, right sides to right sides, and I've lined the needle up with the crease line for this first fold, and then we're going to sew. There's step one. So I've done a plain stitch or a straight stitch along the first crease of the bias binding, and then we fold it over and fold over again to cover the raw edges on the back, and then we're going to stitch in the ditch. So stitch in the ditch, which basically means stitching in the crease created between the two fabrics. Now I'm using a black thread, so it shows up and you can see exactly where it's going, but you would obviously use a matching thread to the bias binding or the main fabric if you've got two different colours. Whichever one fits best, probably the bias binding colour. Okay, so let's do that. Now take your time and really get in the ditch, because the neater it is in the ditch, the better your work's going to look. Okay, so there you can just about make out the black stitching which has been put in a ditch. Now if that was a nice red stitch, you'd hardly see that at all, and that would be a lovely bottom hem to someone's skirt. And on the back you can see this would be the inside of the skirt. You've enclosed the raw edges of the main body of fabric, and that is a single bound bias binding. Now we're looking at the double bound bias binding. We start in exactly the same way by stitching along this front crease line, this first crease line. So line up the edges of your fabric and away you go. There's step one. The difference between a single and a double bound bias binding is when we fold over the bias binding this time, we're going to fold over this edge and then fold it in half. So when we come to the back of the fabric, those raw edges are encompassed, and we encompass the raw edge of the bias tape. But before I get started in sewing that, I'm just going to give it a quick press. So I've given it a good press, I've opened out the seam, I've folded it over, and obviously the raw edges are now covered by the back of the bias binding, and the raw edge of the bias binding is folded under so it can't be seen. And then all we do is the same again, the same stitching as before, stitch in the ditch, and that will attach and enclose the hem at the back. Again, take your time, get the needle lined up from the very first stitch, and take your time to get it sewn right in the ditch. And making sure, top tip, if you look underneath and you can see the stitches, which we can't here, you're going to miss the back of the bias binding. So make sure you can't see any stitching. So let's give it a go. So there we have it. We can see we've stitched in the ditch all the way along. You just see I've come out of the ditch there a little bit, and if you were to use a matching thread it wouldn't matter too much, but in this contrasting thread, you know, you can see the mistakes really well. So that's not what you want to achieve. You want to achieve this nice sewn stitching in the ditch. So if I show you the back now, you can see my wobble much more obviously, but that's encompassed all the raw edges of the fabric and the bias binding. So that would be the decorative edge of the outside of your skirt, and then on the inside, nice comfortable hidden raw edges so it doesn't irritate the skin. So there you go guys, we've done single bound bias binding and a double bound bias binding. I hope you take a note on this skills tutorial, because the next project we're going to be using this, and I look forward to seeing you watch it. And don't forget to press the subscribe button, and